everyone to our monthly event and seminar of the Neurohumanities Network. Just a reminder as to who we are. We are a group of neurology trainees, fellows, students, and attendings who are interested in the intersection between the humanities, the arts, and the neurosciences. This is the team that is constantly growing. The core members are myself, Charlie Parmel, Gaina Gaiman, Jay Doolittle, and we have a few students who are joining us as well, Devika, Rita, and Max, our latest addition. We also want to acknowledge that our group has been supported by the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School that shares a lot of the objectives of our own group. And what we do here are, in addition to these monthly virtual seminars, we also have some booster sections which are more focused on the practice of the neurohumanities. We have a YouTube channel where you may find an archive of all of the seminars. And we also have a social media presence that thus far has been included X or Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky. We also have a website under development that's coming probably this summer. It's coming up, and there's been a lot of work from our students on it, and we're very appreciative of this. We also have a newsletter. You can take down the QR code right here, and we're happy to share the link to the newsletter at the end as well. And we also want to acknowledge what just happened. For those of you who are not neurologists in the audience, we welcome you, whether you're an artist, a patient, or a humanist. But we also want to let you know that the American Academy of Neurology just had its annual meeting, and it was a great meeting. And we saw some of our Neurohumanities Network members that have appeared showing posters or even platform presentations. And we want to say also that there was a wonderful event, a teaming up of the history section and also two of our former speakers from the Neurohumanities Network. So that was an absolutely fantastic event. And now this was also a great opportunity to meet some speakers, including Dr. Javi Suarez, who's going to lead our discussion today. So today's speaker is Dr. Javi Suarez, who's a medical doctor, who was trained in neurology at the Mass General and Brigham Hospital, and most recently became not only a movement disorders fellow, but now a movement disorder attending at the University of Minnesota. And we're very excited for today's event, which I've had the luck of seeing already twice. And this will focus on the neuropsychology of comics. And I just want to say that Dr. Javi Suarez is really a well-rounded, not only clinician, but also humanist, who introduced me and many of our colleagues to the world of the neuropsychology of comic books. And without further ado, Javi, take it away. I'm very excited to hear this version of your talk.
That was a very kind intro. Thanks so much, Matt. Yeah, no, happy to talk about this stuff at any and all times. Yeah, I love comics. I've gotten to know and grow kind of my appreciation for them over the years. I started reading not a very little bit. My dad got me a couple of random issues of the Flash and Spider-Man when I was a kid, and I never like really started reading until I was in college, actually. So much later in life, I kind of got more into it, and since then um, like read all kinds of stuff, and it's just a really cool and interesting art form, very unique in what it can do and how it can present stories and information. And so happy to talk about it today. So thanks for having me. And this is very free form. So if anyone has questions or anything, you just I think the raise hand function and such works, or maybe not, or just unmute yourself, whatever. I'm happy to just have a chat here. So we're going to talk very briefly initially about the visual system, visual pathways, and then spend the bulk of our time talking about comics themselves and how they are perceived and um, how we work through them and how different creators kind of present things in unique ways in the world of comics. So uh, we'll start again with a brief overview of visual pathways. So as simple as can be here. So visual information. Light comes into the eye through the pupil, cornea, hits back in the retina, travels through the optic nerve to the thalamus and then to the primary visual cortex. And then you've got these two pathways, dorsal pathway, also commonly known as the WARE pathway. It tells you information about spatial relationships of the things that you're seeing. And so the very basic visual primitives, lines and direction, orientation, all of that stuff start to get separated into foreground, background, left, right, etc. And also it tells you stuff about movement as you get more and more higher order processing. Then the ventral pathway is commonly called the what pathway. So that's where you are performing more higher and higher level object recognition. So putting the combination of lines and colors into, okay, this is an object, this is whatever, an apple, a table, etc. And so that is going to be the bulk of our focus is this what pathway, a little bit of where pathway in comics, but of course comics are still, and they are still images. And so there's some information that needs to be pieced out as to foreground, background, but there's not a lot of spatial relations that need to be worked out because they're kind of two-dimensional images. So a lot of this processing happens in this one pathway, although there's lots of communication between the two pathways as well. And of course, in much higher order areas like prefrontal cortex, that really helps to assign meaning and assigns different values to what you're seeing. And that's what I'll talk about here in this next portion, right? We start with when it comes to object recognition, very low level, intermediate level, and then the high level. And this is kind of where the real substance of object recognition comes in, because not only do you see this horse, you can recognize that this is a horse based on different views of it. So different raw information is entering your retinas and is being sent to your visual cortex, but ultimately the object that you recognize is a horse, and you're able to recognize that it is that, even though it's being presented from different points of view. So you have your representation, and you're working with working memory in order to kind of take in different information as your eyes move around and take in different parts of the visual field. You can kind of remember that things are in different spots, and remember that you just saw a horse, so it doesn't just kind of like blip in and out of your memory as you look at it, right? You have some object permanence there. So the other thing that you can do with very high level visual processing is assign different values to things, and you can link them between categories. You can link them between different uh, events, right? So maybe you saw this figure at a carnival, yeah, maybe it's in a movie, maybe you're actually writing one. These things are totally unrelated to an actual horse, but that image is horse shaped. And so you recognize that, despite it being a totally kind of separate category of stuff. And that kind of gets into semantics and language and meaning. And so we won't kind of get into all of that, but that kind of very high level cognitive neurology standpoint. But the other thing you can do is incorporate signals from other sensory modalities, right? So you kind of, if you've been around a horse, maybe you know what it feels like, maybe you know what it sounds like, you know what it smells like, and then of course the emotional valence. And so these things is where all of it together, but there's a lot of information that's contained in that one kind of still visual image, and you're able to do all of these different layers of processing very quickly and automatically. And there's very little conscious effort that is used in order to make these things. And so in comics, which we'll talk about next, that is kind of what is being leveraged by the artists and the writers and the creators, is they're kind of counting on you to be able to do all of these things very quickly and automatically, and hold all of this information in your head as things transition, because comics, which we'll talk about next, are unique in that they're not just sequential art, right? So, what is a comic? You can call it sequential art, but if you think about what that means, right, it's just images in a sequence. Technically, a movie is sequential art, right? Technically, a book you can even consider sequential art. There's just images that are placed in sequence. Maybe then it's juxtaposed sequential static images, but again, that leaves something missing, right? Because you can go to an art gallery and technically those are juxtaposed sequential static images, but So you'd be hard pressed to say that a series of images in a gallery is really a comic, right? So this is the definition from a guy named Scott McCloud. He wrote a book called Understanding Comics, which is great. And there's a lot of stuff that if anyone's interested in reading more about how comics work and the kind of some of that psychology and neuropsychology of it, it's a great read and it's presented in comics format, so it's really easy to read and very visually appealing. So great book. Again, that's Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And so he came up with this definition, right? Juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. Very wordy, very jargony, very kind of intense definition, but it really gets to the core of it, right? And the highlight here is deliberate sequence, and it's intended to convey information, produce an aesthetic response, right? So the other images kind of helps the word balloons and the text, so it's not just pictorial. And that deliberate sequence is where the magic of comics starts to come out, right? So notice here that he doesn't use anything about, well, it's on a page, it's needs to be drawn in a certain style, it needs to be drawn, period. There's no kind of mention of the medium. So if you look at something like a stained glass window in a church, you can have, um, thank you, you can have these series of images, right? They're placed in a deliberate sequence and they're designed to convey information and also produce an aesthetic response. These images tell us a story and they're placed in that deliberate sequence that's meant to be read from left to right, right? And of course, this is not in a newspaper or a magazine format or digital comics, right? This is very different from what most people think of when they think of comics, but it fits that definition. So this is an interesting one here. I had this set up for audience response at the AAN, but this is something that it's interesting to me because it's a little bit of a it starts getting into a little bit of the semantics of it. But um, the the question here is this a comic? And and maybe we can do just a little bit of if folks just raise your hand if you think yes. Yeah, we've got one, maybe a couple of thumbs up. Yeah, three, four. Yeah. So a few folks will say that it is a comic. Yeah. Um, and some say, and presumably the rest either say no or abstaining. I'm just going to assume that you're going to say no, that your vote is no. And so I think that it's an interesting one. So the the deliberate what's perhaps missing for me is um, can you say that there is that these are juxtaposed images in a deliberate sequence? Because you can maybe argue that it's really just one image and other and the text that's so there's not really a sequence. But maybe you could potentially argue that this is one piece and then this is the other piece that's kind of laid out in such a way where your eyes will naturally see this first and then go to this. And so maybe that's the sequence. So I don't know. Maybe I oscillate. Sometimes I say yes, sometimes I say no. Initially, I was a hard no, and I was saying, well, this is just a cartoon with a caption. But um, maybe there's an argument for a juxtaposed deliberate sequence here. But for me, my initial response was no, because again, there's not the second panel, right? And so the next that we'll talk about is icons. So this picture, this plane here is also taken from that Understanding Comics book, and what it is showing is that basically the three extremes of how you can depict things um, visually. And so the bottom right, the most conceptual is language, right? So you're just describing what face and then getting even more two eyes, one nose, one mouth. And of course, you can get more and more and more descriptive just in the way that you describe something. As you go further left, you get a closer and closer approximation to reality, right? It starts to look more and more like a real human, in this case, probably some a male face. And then up at the very top is pictures, purely pictures, and it's more abstract and much more um, not even conceptual, but just kind of visual with a little bit less meaning. And most comics tend to be around here. And part of why that is that this way of depicting people and objects and things is iconic, right? And iconic, I'm using that word in a very deliberate sense of um, something that evokes a concept, something that you can divine meaning from and assign your preconceived notions of what this thing is. It's less realistic and it's less about, oh, this is a very specific person. It's kind of just a man's face, right? And the brain has this very uncanny ability to just see that as what it is. You don't you can't not see it as a human face as much as you kind of want to, right? So I'll give you another kind of more intense example of that is this very iconic, right? Charlie Brown, very easily recognizable. Little guy from Peanuts, but if you kind of think about it, why would we see this as a person? Why is it so easily recognizable as a human child? Right? I mean, we've got this thing with these two black voids for eyes and the nose like right in between, like he's got like hollow prismacephaly, right? And just like what even is this? I guess maybe hair. I mean, it's just like does not approximate a human being at all. But your brain just can't help it. You just see just a little boy, and there's nothing wrong with him. He just is a little boy, and that's what that iconic, cartoonish, less realistic art style can do. Is it just kind of pulls you in and allows you to just see this human person, and you can kind of find a lot of your own preconceived notions of what a human child is and what a human child acts like, and it's less about Charlie Brown individual entity and more about Charlie Brown is a kid, right? And we can take this a step further and get rid of all facial features. And the power of comics here is that you can see something like this and just kind of get it, right? And you kind of know what this being is thinking even without a face, right? And that has a lot to do with your exposure to things like this, right? Maybe used to this kind of reminds me of like at The Office, right? Someone says some cringy, annoying dialogue, and then they kind of do the Zoom take. That kind of is like took over a lot of comedy type shows in the like 2010s. I feel like 2000s to 2010s. I feel like every show wanted to be like The Office, and they all did the thing where they like will like zoom in on the person's face, and so you have that association, and you just kind of get it. Again, there's no need for even that level of realism when it comes to faces and human reactions, right? So, um, any questions, comments, anything before we move on here? No, great. So, next we'll talk a little bit about the way that these concepts are different between Eastern and Western comics. When I say East, I'm mostly referring to Japanese manga. That's just my personal bias. And when I say West, I'm mostly referring to American comics. There's a whole world of comics out there that are made by people from all over the world, but that's just my own personal bias. I can't read everything, and so that's kind of what I'll be presenting. So um, often um, American comics, especially early on, partly due to the limitations of the medium, they were superhero comics were pretty much exclusively printed on paper. And back then, the technology was such that they could really only print a few colors. And so the because of that, the artists kind of adapted to that and made these iconic figures. Not, they tried to kind of make them realistic, but there's only so much that they could do, right? And so it was this very kind of eye-catching, very kind of flat colors, and very simple, easy to understand shapes. And now American comics have really, and superhero comics in particular, have kind of gone crazy with the technology that's available and created these like insane spectacles, right? Like these crazy crackles and particles and these huge scenes and big giant um, event that take place on the page. And notice a shift away from that iconic style into a more realistic style. And this is kind of again another extreme example of that. This is from Kingdom Come by um, Mark Waid and Alex Ross. And so Alex Ross very famously has this like painterly style. He draws superheroes, but he does it in this hyper realistic style. This is probably the most realistic artist in comics maybe ever, at least the most well known. So like just the details on the clothes, like everything, you can almost like imagine this happening. But what that does is it almost pulls you it pulls you into a certain extent, but it also pulls you away a little bit because what are these guys thinking? What are they feeling? You kind of just like see that, okay, this is a very particular man. This is like a guy, right? Versus this is an example from a comic called Jujutsu Kaisen. This is Japanese, so you start on the top right and you work your way kind of opposite to the Western style from left to right. And what is very common in the Japanese art style is that the characters are very iconic and their expressions are extremely iconic, right? So we know exactly, okay, this guy threw this fastball, and we know exactly this guy's shocked by it. There's no mystery to what he's thinking or feeling. Um, Yet these larger than life kind of very iconic, very expressive characters are rendered against these very realistic backdrops. Like, look at this like building, like that's a real ass building. Like that could be a school, a real school in Japan, and his clothes even are. You can imagine him wearing these things. And so what this does is it pulls you into exactly what these characters are feeling and thinking, but you can also believe that they exist in the world, right? American comics tend not to do that. They tend to pick a style and stick with it. I'll show you an example of that in a minute, but here this is from Boruto, and this guy just took a bite out of something, and so I don't know. What do we think? What is he reacting to? Anyone bold enough to say or put in the chat what we think?
I would say a snack, but I don't know if it's tasty.
Yeah, so it's got to vote for tasty snack.
We have some D's in the chat.
Very good. Yeah, what do we got here? Yeah, D, D, B, C. Yeah, good. So yeah, so what these actually for this is super good, right? And so that's kind of the other thing that they can do is they really play with your expectations of this this face doesn't necessarily match. This is super good. He almost looks distressed. He's sweating. He's got this like furrowed brow. The lines across it's like this big dramatic thing, but he just had a little tasty snack, right? And that's something that again, Japanese comics really like to play with that the intensity of the emotions that are being elicited, right? Compare that to an American comic. This is from Superman Unchained. And this is by Jim Lee, another kind of very realistic art style guy. Um, Everything's kind of rendered in the same style. So Superman, this bad guy, the tanks, it's all like in that same style. Everything is kind of monotonous, and it's not necessarily one way is bad, better or worse. It's just different in the choices that tend to be made. And then the opposite is this, right? This is Captain America. Again, characters and background, the guns, outfits, it's all rendered in the same style. Um, and that is a common theme. So now we're going to start pushing some boundaries, right? This is a comic called My Favorite Thing is Monsters. And the thing here is it is written from the perspective of this girl who's kind of this like weird wolf person, but it's her journal. And the entire thing is every page is on this spiral, is in this spiral notebook. And it's drawn in this kind of pen, exclusively pen. There's no other kind of colors or inks. It's almost like this little girl did this herself. And they take it a step further and include, you can almost imagine her like taping or stapling this little Valentine directly onto her notebook, right? And then this is, of course, it's not when you're looking at the comic, it's just paper, but um, they incorporate the holes of the paper. In real life, a notebook would have those holes, and so you couldn't draw on the hole and the artist uses that whole as part of the art. So this little microneedle, part of the hole is in that notebook, that spiral notebook hole, right? So that's the kind of cool stuff that can be done in comics. That's uh, how would you ever depict that? How could you do this with either the written word or even movies, right? You'd have to kind of commit to a very particular thing, and it would be kind of hard to watch a movie that was all like on paper, right? So this is something that's very unique and cool. Um, and yeah, so I forgot I had arrows here. So next is this is a comic called Ice Cream Man, and it's a kind of an existential horror comic anthology series, but really getting to the heart of basically everything that I'm talking about. Just this guy just put it on the page, right? So he starts with this is an image of Doug as drawn by his daughter Jenny. This is actually Doug who's late to pick up Jenny. An image of a clock. All right, Doug, and he starts talking about some nasty things about Doug, the symbol of the broken heart, and then boom, this is the real Doug. So not really, it's just another image. And then this is the real Doug. So now we've got all sorts of layers of meta commentary of comics and images and what's real, what's not real. And in this book, this kind of is the real Doug, right? Because this is the Doug that exists in this world and is interacting with the other characters and is interacting with the other people. This is the image. This is, a drawing of Doug, and this is some sort of in this world, this almost otherworldly, like bizarre representation of Doug. So again, multi-layered, very um, high concept type of comic, and here in a much less serious way, playing with the concept of a speech bubble, right? So there's rumor the British are moving north. What is this you doing here? You got him. He's an English spy, and how else could you have done it, right? Like you just saying the word rumor, you wouldn't know that this person is British, right? So it's not that he's speaking necessarily with an accent. He said the you or the word the you appeared in his speech bubble. Um, so I think this is just genius and just like a perfect like way um, to kind of play off of the comic structure and again like this meta narrative of what a comic is and how characters live inside the comic. So um, I'll pause here again. Any comments there? I kind of ran through a few of those examples quickly. So um, anything? No. Okay. Or yes, Galina, go ahead.
Javi, I can't help but jump in. I'm curious about kind of as you've looked through various comics, what is the typical like bend towards humor versus what you might call like serious stories and has there been a shift over time and any comment on that?
That's a great question. I think yes, it depends a lot on what you read. I think comics very much, especially just like in in the world that we have now, there is anything that you can think of has been made into a comic. Every genre, every type of story, from super silly to totally serious to really like I hate to use the word artsy because I feel like that has like a negative connotation, but like very like literary high concept. Um, so it's all over the place. I think that it started very, especially popular comics started more as these like the comic strips on the newspaper, just like these funny little things, a couple of panels. Um, but with more and better technology, they started being able to print like larger comics, right? And so superhero comics were really kind of the first ones that took off in popularity. Superman Action Comics, I think, was in 1930s when it first came out, and then the golden age of the 60s with Spider-Man and Thor and the Avengers and all of that, and they I think tended to be very cheesy, very corny, very you know, there's a reason we kind of call it like a cartoon villain, right? Like that phrase comes a lot from these like old comics of like this guy dressed in a funny suit and twirling it's just this big long mustache and like taking over the world kind of thing. And slowly over time, um, people I think took comics a little bit more seriously, um, and they've evolved to be able to tell lots of very interesting stories, some with very serious subject matter. But there's still plenty of people who write fun, silly comics like this, like this. And this is especially this type of comic, humor and fun comics, I think now um, are social media. So people on Instagram are almost always doing something funny. And I think part of that is how social media has taken over just how we live, and it's all over the place. And it's, I think, the way that they live and the way that they kind of can do anything with comics on social media is through engagement. And putting out a very serious comic on something like Instagram, Twitter, etc., might not get as much engagement as this like fun, silly comic that people share and like, etc., and all of that. So I think that it started off funny, kind of had this arc where there things got a little bit more bombastic and silly and fun to much more serious. And now we're kind of in this other side of things where nobody reads newspapers anymore, but they're on social media. So people adapt. And that's where you see these kind of more simple, more funny comics. And then you have the books that are tackling kind of longer form stories and sometimes more serious subject matter. Did that answer your question? Right. Okay. So we'll move on to the gutter. So this is again part of where really the magic happens. So we've got these two panels. We've got this guy saying how you die, and this other guy saying no, no, and yeah, with in the night. Something happened in between here and here, right? And that constraint, that ability of your brain to see this image and then see this image and understand that they are connected in some way. Well, you need to connect this to this. Your brain does not like uh, gaps, right? And that's part of why there's so many optical illusions that exist. Is Yeah, if you've seen, I used to have these in here, and I took them out just for time's sake. But if you've ever seen the like the Kaneza triangle, where it's three like little Pac-Man looking things, and you see a triangle, even though there's not really like a formed triangle. Well, part of it is your brain just is a prediction machine much more than it is a perception machine. You're very rarely just taking in information and just seeing things. You're always interpreting things in context, and you're always applying your previous experience to what you're seeing, and you can't help it. It's you just are doing it. And most people don't think they're doing it, you don't realize you're doing it. You kind of just think that you're seeing things, but there's a lot of processing that's taking place when you are taking in any sort of visual or any sort of sensory information. So what comics do is leverage that. These people know that you're able to do that, and they know that you can take this information and apply it in this way and make inferences and predictions and judgments. It doesn't necessarily um, apply to everyone in all cases. And comics, although they're very easy for, I think, probably most people on this call to read and interpret and understand, part of that is because we've learned. And comics, even this purely visual, there's no text associated here. There's a lot of structure, and there's a lot of similarities to language processing that takes place when you're reading a comic, right? So you need continuity constraint. You need to understand that these are the same people. These events are linked. They're not just other people that look the same, and that there's some sort of um, event structure whereby these people are doing something with relation to each other, and there is a movement forward in time as you move along with the story, right? And all of that is learned. It's not necessarily inherent. And there are some cultures along the world that do not use this structure. They're not familiar with this kind of visual narrative. And then actually you show them a comic and they don't understand. They don't know like what is going on. And you have to kind of show them multiple times and then they kind of get it. Um, and so it is kind of this learned skill, and it is dependent on your previous experiences, and it is processed very similarly to language. right? And so we'll skip through these for time's sake. Um, and these are just showing the different types of transitions. And so you can have something where it's very like very little happens in between. This is kind of the most common one that is used in American comics. We call it action to action, right? So something is happening between here and here. There's some action that takes place after each panel. Um, and this is different scenes, so different kind of similar, but kind of from different points of view. And then different scenes from that may or may not be related. And then this is much more commonly used in Japanese comics, and I'll show you some examples of that, right? So this is what we call aspect to aspect. So it's the same scene, just different pieces of that scene, and not necessarily time is not necessarily advancing, and the plot or story is not necessarily advancing. You're just seeing things from different points of view. Tends to slow things down. And this is just like a non sequitur, totally unrelated, right? So going back to East and West. So this is an example of an American comic, right? This is All-Star Superman, and American comics, and maybe there's some that says something about the American culture. Very commonly, it's something is happening. It's go, go, go. Something is advancing with each panel. So Clark and Lois are here in the middle of the street in this first panel. Then they're a little further. You can kind of see and infer where they are here compared to where they are in this panel. Then the next one, they're further along. Things are happening, and then they're even further along. So there's forward momentum, action, action, action. Even here, and this is from Watchmen, slower, more panels here. And we'll talk about kind of time in a moment, but each one, he's moving forward. There is something happening at each step, right? Contrast that with this comic. This is from a comic called One Punch Man. So you have this giant explosion from there's people on a different train, their point of view. And now we see there's like some little thing in the crater, and we get a zoom in of this rippling muscles. We get a zoom in of these weird antenna, and then like a full detailed image of this ripped alien creature. But think about what actually happened throughout this entire thing. We saw an explosion, and then we saw an alien. Not really much quote unquote action happened in all of these panels, but what it's doing is drawing your attention and heightening the point is not that things are moving. The point is that there is this like weird alien thing that landed, right? And that kind of pulling you into these different aspects and slowing things down is much more common in Japanese comics than American ones. So again, we're going to start pushing some boundaries with the gutter. So this here is from a newer comic. It's called Absolute Wonder Woman. And now here with kind of the panel shape and structure, you got Wonder Woman who's swinging a gigantic, building size sword, and the panel itself is kind of sword shaped, and so you're naturally kind of following the arc of the sword with the way that the panels are shaped, right? Not, some actions are happening in between here, but really what's fun and interesting is the shape of the panels, which ostensibly are just framing, are mirroring the actions that are happening in the story. This here is from an independent comic called Three Worlds, Three Moons, and this woman is, theoretically kind of sneaking around, all clear, and she's going up this winding staircase, and then the perspective shifts, and you're kind of looking at her from top down, and then you're kind of looking at her head on, and then from the side, and then from the back, and then you kind of pull out. So all of these like perspective shifts kind of work to the the point is not necessarily that you're meant to follow an exact path. The point is that she is going on this journey along this winding path through multiple doors and corridors to get to this place, right? And so you're kind of confused and disoriented with her as you're, following along in this weird perspective shift, right? And then here's an example of a very, very bizarre comic. This is my favorite line is that this should be nobody's first comic. It's called The Filth. It's by a guy named Grant Morrison, and it's just super weird, super high concept sci-fi. But here you have this guy, and he's like freaking out, and these, a yellow guy and a green man. But why I chose this image is because of the disorientation of the speech bubbles, right? We have this guy, and he's talking, but his speech bubble is down here, and this guy, his speech bubble corresponds to this one, and here, and so it's just like this very like upsetting thing. And how could you do this in a movie, right? How could you do this in a book? This is something that really can only exist in comics, and that's part of why I find it so interesting. It takes everything that you thought you knew about a comic and how to read one, and it just like totally messes with you and starts to confuse you. So now I'm going to talk about time, and we have kind of alluded to it in various ways, but these are static images, right? So you're just looking at things happening. So how do you know how much time has passed in between panels, right? Sometimes it's explicit. It'll say, 2 months later or 10 minutes later, almost never happens. So you have to decide. That's that extra layer of participation that makes comics so fun is you have to participate in the pace of the story. You decide how quickly to read things. You decide how much time passed in between these two panels, right? You are filling in the events. And so something like this, now you've got Iron Man, he's asking for a high five from Doctor Strange, awesome facial hair bros, right? They kind of have the same little goatee situation. You know, how much time passes here? Just put in any amount of time in the chat. 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 20 minutes. What do we think?
Say 30 seconds,
Yeah, 30 seconds. Maybe you just sit there and waited for a while.
just for comedic purposes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's see. Now how much time do we think passes now? Probably more, right? I mean, it's by inserting these panels, the artist is literally drawing out this moment and extending it. And even if you went straight from here to here, you're perceiving these images no matter what. Like your brain is taking, even if it's milliseconds, nanoseconds of time, longer than when it was just the two panels, right? So the creators can add time, they can force you to take more time and force you to perceive more time um, by doing something like this. And this is just a great example of just kind of this. What I'm going to show you just gets to the heart of time in comics, and I think they just like really nail it. So this guy comes back, he's all injured, defeated again, as I calculated. I don't think you calculate. What's 5 + 2? 7. And then he says that took you two panels, right? So this is just perfect, right? That took you two panels, which what does that mean, right? This could have been this little face that he made here could be less than a second. But because we see it and then he says 7, we are perceiving that it took him a minute. It took him a second. He paused and then he said 7, right? Versus if he had just asked what's 5 + 2 and 7, we see that and we associate that with much more immediate response, right? So this is kind of getting to that heart of some that the panel is a meaningful unit of time that forces you to perceive some amount of time passing, right? So that is just I think a beautiful example of that. And here, this is Ice Cream Man again, right? This freaky horror comic. This is a scene where a guy has had a bad car accident. He's being flung through the windshield, and might be a little hard to see here, but they're again kind of doing some meta commentary on comic structure and time. But what I like here is that this instance of decompression, by that he means he's taking by inserting these multiple panels, right, to show drag out the scene, um, gives him the sliver of time. So the creator is admitting to giving not just us the reader time, not just us, we are not just perceiving this moment longer, but the character is getting time. This man he is giving him time to have a thought of, his, Sally and Samantha, whatever, whatever. So that extra layer of that meta commentary of the comic structure of, well, we're not just getting time is not just passing slower for us, it's actually passing more slowly for the characters. And that's what he's doing, is giving that character time, right? We'll wrap up here with motion. And again, still images. It's just a series of static images. But oftentimes, we associate comics with action, right? Superhero comics, there's lots of this big, big action things happening. Characters move. But how do you depict motion? One way is to just purely rely on the gutter. So you show this image here, this the baton is up here, the sword is back here, and then the next panel, they're clashing, right? And so the gutter is doing the work of, and then, she gets kicked and catches the sword. And so gutter is where the motion is happening. You are using your powers of perception to make the characters move so that these two images make sense next to each other in that order, right? In order to get from here to here, they must have moved, right? So that's where the motion happens, is in the gutter. Other comics, this is from the Amazing Spider-Man. Sorry, this is from a comic called Why the Last Man. Use big exaggerated motion lines, right? So this is this is more where that wear pathway comes in, right? So when we see a moving object, very often it has we call them motion lines, motion blur, things where that leave a trail in our field of vision as things move, and creators can take advantage of that and basically draw in lines to depict motion. And very often, the bigger the movement, the more big and bombastic and exaggerated these lines are, right? Um, Japanese comics take that to the next level, and they are, I mean, this is that speed that you feel is depicted by these like intense lines and this like really super zooming in um, effect uh, to just capture motion, but in particular, very, very fast motion, right? So less, really intense blurring effects and really intense lines. This is from a Transformers comic, much more recent one, where this guy Daniel Warren Johnson kind of uses these manga uh, tropes and these manga techniques to depict, these robots transforming and then like flying, and you can really like uses the blurring and takes the blurring to another level. So this guy is zooming and then moving it in this direction and that direction, and things are blowing up and they're passing each other. And again, the speed, you can feel that the intensity of the speed because of how the things are blurred compared to when things are more still. They're not blurred, right? So really emphasizing that movement, right? So the last thing I'll talk about is horror, and horror is very difficult in comics. I spent a lot of time talking about how much participation there is in comics, how much you um, are pulled in, how much you are doing the work of deciding how much time passes, the motion that happens, how quickly does the motion happen, um, and horror relies a lot on timing, right? So if you read a story, you're reading the thing, and there's a build up, and then a release, right? If you ever seen a horror movie, right? A lot of what makes a movie scary is not seeing the monster, but knowing that there could be a monster around the corner at any time, right? It's that anticipation that's scary. And there's a line that I heard somewhere. It said, "You're not afraid of being alone in the dark. You're afraid of not being alone in the dark," right? And so that type of tension is difficult when things are all laid out and you can just kind of read and skip. That it's hard to build that tension when you have so much control as a reader, right? And so oftentimes what horror comics rely on is just kind of that like freaky factor, just really good artists drawing really nasty, freaky things. And I won't show you anything too crazy, but this is just kind of an example of some way to build a little bit of tension. So this guy, he opens his eyes, wants some bacon and eggs, and this creepy spider crawls out of the egg, right? So relatively tame, but a way to use that pacing of like, oh, just the egg. Whoa, there's like a weird light coming out, and the freaky spider comes out. But you can imagine you just kind of can read this. Some of that tension is um, dissolved or eliminated because you can control how quickly this happens. Versus, again, you can imagine this playing out in a movie, and this all happens much more slowly, and there's a musical sting, and then there's all this other lighting or whatever. So horror comics, very cool. There are some really good horror comics out there, um, but it's hard to do for that reason. So I'll leave you with this. This is one of my other fun kind of favorite fun, just silly comics, and that's kind of what I have for you guys. It's not not a ton. I know we kind of talked about a few things, moved through a few things quickly, but I'm happy to kind of go back and clarify um, any topic and go through some of the panels more slowly if people are interested. But yeah, let's just we can open up for questions, discussion.
Javi, thank you so much for that whirlwind tour. I feel like we're, pacing through a fast animated book. I would love to hear if there's any questions in the audience. Anything Q&A or
Yeah,
anyone has
Mateo, go
raised their
ahead.
hand?
Yeah.
Yeah, and absolutely. This was fantastic, and I want to also leave space for anyone in the audience while the questions are carbureting. But you piqued my interest at one point when you were talking about the gather and how it's used um, as sort of an innate way in which the brain connects two different panels, right? And I know that Gombrich also talks about some of this prediction in his neuropsychology of art. Then you said something else that also piqued my interest, which was, well, not all cultures are primed to read comics in the same ways or to read comics in the way we read comics. Can you expand a little bit on that in terms of in which cultures we see comics and how they became so universal in the East and the West, and also what are some ways people don't read comics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that it does seem to be a fairly ubiquitous kind of art form. I mean, we see comics all over the world, and I think that a lot of people associate. And I had this in a previous version where I talked about hieroglyphs and hieroglyphics and how that is these like images that are used to convey information, but that really is just language, right? That the if you can picture like an Egyptian hieroglyph and it's like the shape of a bird, well, that's not really depicting a bird. That like bird means something in terms of language. So that bird might be equivalent to the letter A or whatever it is. I just made that up. So I apologize if anyone actually knows about hieroglyphs, if I just said something totally insane. But the point is that symbol, I mean, it is a symbol. It means something else. Whereas comics, you would be you draw a bird and that is supposed to be a bird. It's not supposed to be like a letter, right? So um, we see lots of uses of images as language, but less so. And so folks, different cultures who have a harder time understanding comics tend to be those who don't use, don't have like a written language, or they don't have visual representations for their language. So that's not many cultures now in modern times, but the guy who I pulled that figure from, this is Khan, um, mentioned some, and I apologize, I don't have the name of the particular tribe memorized, but it's tribes in sub-Saharan Africa that don't have as much contact with European and other Western kind of countries that come in, and they're relatively undisturbed by colonization. They they tend not to have written languages, or again visual depictions for language, and so they use images in a different way, in a much more literal way, and it's less of this kind of conceptual continuity constraint in a sequence. And that is the type of culture that tends to have a harder time with comics at first, but it is something that again can be learned. And then as to why so many different place subcultures, I mean, part of it is communication, part of it is, um, yeah, I think that's a harder question for me to answer. It'd be just kind of pontificating. Um, But I think part of it is people just start talking to each other as different, information started to be much more easily dispersed. People saw that people were doing and drawing in this way and using art in this way, and they said, "Oh, that's cool. I want to do that." And um, yeah, as to why, I think that an interesting kind of thing for me was really kind of seeing the differences in how the iconic imagery versus realistic imagery, how it does seem to be kind of substantially and meaningfully different in Japanese versus American comics, and why that is and how that developed. I don't have an answer for it, but I think um, that is particularly interesting to me of why do they use these iconic faces with the realistic backgrounds? Why don't we do that? Why don't Western cultures tend to do that? I,
That was kind of my,
again,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, please. That's all. I'm
I
just
was
rambling
gonna,
now.
that's actually what I was gonna to ask about too, because I almost feel like it's an interesting like juxtaposition of the East versus the West comics, where East seems like there's such a focus on the emotional face and not needing to be a realistic emotional face. It's almost like the face becomes even less realistic as it just like displays this enormous emotion. I haven't seen that much like West comics, to be honest with you, but it kind of strikes me that is that what you notice as well too? It almost seems like there's more of this like focus on the face and this like explosive emotion kind of feeling.
That's right. And the other thing that I didn't talk about, but that tends to be more the case, certainly for like comedic effect, if there's some like kind of a silly moment happening, but even
Yeah.
in more serious moments, the the main characters, the protagonists, the heroes tend to be more expressive and more iconic than the villains, right? So if you
Yeah.
look at this face,
Hmm.
like this is like a very realistic face, like there's lots of detail in the nose and the eyebrows and the mouth, etc. And that then Scama Cloud talks about this in that understanding comic books, is that kind of creates this othering effect, right? Where the iconic imagery really pulls you in and you can really relate to exactly what that character is feeling and thinking.
Yeah.
Where when you make it more realistic, it kind of distances you from that character. It's like, oh, this is like this like different, like very particular guy, whereas like, oh yeah, he's surprised. Like I get that. I can relate to that.
Yeah.
And that is used quite a bit in Japanese in comics. And if you read, or if anyone here is reading or starting to read, like pay attention to how the villains are drawn versus the heroes and the protagonists, and you may notice that when they want to add lots of drama, there's like something serious and bad happening, things get more realistic, and especially with the villains.
Mm.
Yeah, likewise, I also thought that what you were saying about, if I'm understanding correctly, the ability of Eastern comics, Japanese comics to really jump back and forth between different artistic styles as needed to convey an emotion, as opposed to what a lot of Western comics do, which is wanting to stick to a certain style as time goes by. It makes me think a lot about also the sort of cognitive flexibility required to really switch back and forth and knowing that that's the same character, but that just you're trying to convey a different state, emotional state. So I thought
Right, exactly.
interesting, yeah.
Yeah, they're much more liberal with that. They just like switch constantly and really are not afraid to make the style switch. Whereas, yeah, exactly, like the American comics, they just it's just this the whole time. And again, there's nothing necessarily bad or wrong with that. This like has its role for like, this is the world, these are the characters. You're watching this happen to someone else. Whereas I think some of the benefits of that Japanese style is you get pulled in a little bit. It's a little bit more easy to connect with the characters and what they're feeling.
If I can have you, another thing that I heard Scott McCloud talk about that I thought was really interesting and really relevant to our group, I think, was this idea that you can make a comic or sometimes you should make a comic or a graphic novel without any thought bubbles. And one of the things that I heard him talk about is if you have a comic without thought bubble saying it's purely image, there's almost some more purity to the medium, and you can really convey thoughts and emotions to just the power of images. Have you come across that, or do you have any thoughts about that? The sort of the pure language of comics through images?
Yes, yes, and so there's a great book, and again, I've had a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't include in the presentation. Again, just I have a bad tendency to ramble, so I just like wanted to keep it nice and tight. But there is a book called Step by Bloody Step, and it is completely and entirely devoid of words of any kind. There's no words. It's just um, images, and it's really excellent. It's kind of a sci-fi book, and it's his whole journey of this child with, and the child is traveling with like this um, giant suit of armor, and um, you're just kind of like, well, where are they going? Where are they going on this journey? There's no words. It's not even like a sometimes what they'll do is they'll put like a primer. It's all text of like, oh, this is the world, this is the situation, almost like a prologue text. Some like high fantasy, high concept sci-fi will do that just to kind of like it's easier to type that all out on one page rather than having several pages of comic dedicated to that. But here, I have it pulled up on my Kindle app. So this is kind of an example here, right? So um, just the whole thing is you see this little girl and there's this thing of suit of armor. We'll kind of go back to the very beginning here, and just this is all you see. It's just a little girl in this giant suit of armor in the snow, and there's not a single word anywhere in the book. And so this is the kind of the example that comes directly to my head. Um, This is rare. It's not common that you'll see this kind of thing, especially in again a more modern book. They like their words, and then it helps to kind of you know again pull you into a story when people are talking. You get to know them. Dialogue is powerful and helpful, but this is you know pure as pure can get in terms of purely visual pictorial storytelling, and it's really good. It's really well done. It's very beautiful art, and a weird sci-fi setting, and fun. So I highly recommend it. It's only 4 issues, and it's a pretty it's quick if you want it to be quick, but if you're like me and you kind of sit with the details and you look at all the little pieces, and it can be a much longer read, and I almost think it not having words almost makes you read it more. It takes longer to read because you almost want to like take it all in. Okay, like I don't know what's going on because they're not telling me, they're not talking, so it almost like forces you to like try to pick out these other details so that you can form conclusions about the world. So very, very cool book.
Javi, this has been amazing. I feel like I'm gonna step in as the villain and have to end us because we are at time and I want to respect people's time. But I have to say this, I have way more questions than answers. I have so many things that you've kind of in whetted the appetite for us to go and read and see more. It was a truly decadent talk, just beautiful visually and so many concepts introduced. So I truly want to thank you for your presence tonight and for really, I think, setting the stage for more questions. Thanks for pulling up that
Absolutely.
optic nerve. And Mattia, if you'll share, I just want to say if this has excited you, I'm excited to let you know that this month, our engagement contest is we're actually holding a cartoon contest. So, what we encourage you to do is if you were inspired by this talk, we are accepting entries to our Neurohumanities cartoon contest. Feel free to draw a comic. Now we know the difference between that and a cartoon or any other graphic related to the neurohumanities. You can submit this online. It could be a quick pencil draw, something extensive, something multi-paneled, whatever you comes to your mind. These are being collected over the course of this month, due by the end of the month, and then we'll post them for voting, and the winner will get a prize. So please contribute. We want your ideas, and we can't thank you enough again, Javi, for inspiring us tonight and reminding us, I think, of at least for me, something I used to love and have sort of lost touch with, and kind of want to go back and get some more visual reading in my life. With that, I actually want to share what our upcoming next talk is. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Luca Marsili about the faces of neuroscience. So join us in May. If this was exciting, we hope to see you again. And lots more coming, both programming, lectures, seminars, as well as booster sessions in the summer, including a mindfulness booster session to talk about some jnana yoga and other ways of connecting with the humanities. So thank you tonight for joining us, and please send in your comments, leave your ideas. We have a little feedback survey, so if you have other talks you want to hear, we want to hear from you. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone. Thanks again, Javi.
Thanks for having me, guys. Take care.